6 million people walk through those towering stone pillars every single year. They stand in front of the Rosetta Stone with their phones out, snapping photos. They crane their necks up at the Parthenon marbles, marveling at 2,000-year-old muscles carved into cold white marble. They walk away thinking they just visited the greatest temple of human knowledge ever built. They didn't. They walked through a crime scene, one that's still open, one where the evidence is still sitting behind bulletproof glass, still labeled with polite little plaques that never quite tell you the whole story. The British Museum holds more than 8 million objects, and a staggering number of them were never discovered, never gifted, never bought in any transaction either side would call fair. They were taken, at gunpoint, at cannon point, or at the point of a treaty written by the winners and signed by nobody who actually owned the thing being signed away. Today, we're going to walk through 4 of the most infamous items in that building and trace the blood, the smoke, and the gunpowder that got each one of them onto a shelf in London. If you think history shouldn't stay locked behind glass with the ugly parts edited out, hit subscribe right now, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell here at Chronosphere Academy, the version they don't put on the plaque. Let's start with the most famous rock in the world. But before we get to the rock, it's worth spending just a moment on how the British Museum came to exist in the first place. Because even its origin story carries a shadow most visitors never hear about. The museum was founded in 1753, built around the private collection of a physician named Sir Hans Sloane, who had spent decades amassing tens of thousands of specimens, books, and curiosities from around the known world. On paper, it's a story about curiosity and Enlightenment-era science. Sloane is often celebrated as one of history's great collectors, a man whose personal library of natural wonders became the seed of the greatest museum on Earth. What's left out of most of the plaques is where a significant part of Sloane's fortune actually came from. Early in his career, Sloane spent time in Jamaica, where he married into a family that owned sugar plantations worked by enslaved people. The wealth generated by that plantation, and by the broader sugar economy built on slave labor across the British Caribbean, helped fund the very collecting habit that eventually became the British Museum. It's a detail that quietly sets the tone for everything that follows. Even before a single soldier marched into Benin or a single earl took a saw to the Parthenon, the institution meant to house the world's greatest treasures had already been financed, in part by one of history's greatest crimes. With that foundation in mind, let's finally get to the rock everyone actually comes to see. Ask 100 tourists standing in room 4 how the Rosetta Stone got to London, and most of them will tell you some version of the same story. Brave British archaeologists, digging in the desert sun, unearthing the key that finally unlocked ancient Egyptian writing after 1,400 years of silence. It's a nice story. It's also almost entirely wrong. The stone wasn't found by the British at all. It was found by French soldiers in the summer of 1799, while Napoleon Bonaparte's army was busy invading Egypt as part of his campaign to cut off Britain's trade route to India. A French officer supervising the rebuilding of a fort near the town of Rosetta noticed a slab of dark granite with 3 different scripts carved into it and had the sense to realize it might matter. It mattered more than anyone in that fort could have possibly imagined. That slab held the same royal decree written 3 times. Once in ancient hieroglyphics, once in a simpler Egyptian script called Demotic, and once in ancient Greek. For the first time in over a millennium, scholars had a way to actually translate the picture language of the pharaohs. Napoleon's scholars were ecstatic. They began making copies, studying it obsessively, treating it as one of the great intellectual prizes of the entire expedition. And then Napoleon lost. In 1801, British and Ottoman forces crushed the French army in Egypt, and as part of the surrender terms, something remarkable happened. A British general named John Haley Hutchinson didn't just accept the French military surrender. He demanded something extra: every single Egyptian antiquity the French had collected during their occupation. The French scholars were livid. Several of them said they would rather burn their own life's work, rather throw the Rosetta Stone straight into the Mediterranean than hand their discovery over to the British as a war trophy. They didn't get a vote. Nobody with cannons pointed at them ever really does. Under the terms of the Treaty of Alexandria, the stone was confiscated and shipped to England, where it was presented to King George III and eventually donated to the British Museum. To this day, if you look closely at the side of the stone, You can still see the faded white paint where someone once wrote, quite proudly, "Captured in Egypt by the British Army in 1801. Now here's the detail that should stop you cold. The one detail that gets buried under all the drama of Britain versus France. At no point in this entire chain of events, not when the French found it, not when the British confiscated it, not when it was shipped across the sea and put on permanent display, did anyone ask a single Egyptian person what should happen to it. The most important artifact for understanding ancient Egyptian civilization changed hands twice between two European empires in a dispute that had absolutely nothing to do with Egypt's own right to its own history. Egypt wasn't a participant in the negotiation. Egypt was the prize. That pattern, a story about African or Middle Eastern history decided entirely by European powers arguing among themselves, is going to repeat itself over and over again as we go deeper into this museum. And nowhere does it turn more violent than what happened next, in a kingdom on the other side of the African continent. Because while the Rosetta Stone was taken through paperwork and treaties, what happened in West Africa was taken through fire, machine guns, and a death toll that never made it onto any museum plaque. Picture a city surrounded by earthen walls, stretching for miles, some of the largest man-made structures anywhere on the African continent at the time, longer in total length than the Great Wall of China. Picture a royal palace inside those walls, its wooden pillars wrapped in gleaming brass plaques depicting centuries of kings, warriors, battles, and rituals. A visual archive of an entire civilization's history, cast in bronze by artisans whose techniques rivaled anything happening in Renaissance Europe. That was the Kingdom of Benin, in what is now southern Nigeria, at the end of the 19th century. It wasn't a primitive village waiting to be civilized. It was a sophisticated, centralized kingdom with its own courts, its own guilds of master metalworkers, its own centuries-deep tradition of documenting royal history in cast bronze and carved ivory. The British Empire wanted something Benin had: control over the region's lucrative trade in palm, oil, and rubber, resources feeding directly into Britain's industrial machine back home. The Oba, the king of Benin, wasn't interested in handing that control over. He'd seen what happened to neighboring kingdoms that opened their doors to British trade agreements, and he kept the British at arm's length. In January of 1897, a British trade delegation attempted to march into Benin City during Igi, one of the kingdom's most sacred annual religious festivals, a time when, by long-standing custom, outsiders were explicitly forbidden from entering. The Oba's messengers warned the British repeatedly not to come. They came anyway. A confrontation broke out. Several British officers were killed. Back in London, this single incident was reported not as the predictable result of a foreign delegation deliberately violating a sacred taboo, but as a savage, unprovoked massacre of innocent Englishmen. It became the perfect pretext for something the Empire had almost certainly wanted to do anyway. Within weeks, Britain assembled what it officially called the Punitive Expedition, a name that tells you exactly how it was framed back home, as righteous punishment rather than what it actually was. It wasn't a battle. It was an extermination. British forces arrived armed with Maxim guns, early machine guns capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, against Benin warriors who were fighting with muskets, swords, and spears. It wasn't a fair fight in any sense of the word, and it was never meant to be. Benin City was burned to the ground almost entirely. The Oba fled and was later captured and sent into exile, where he would die years later, never allowed to return home. And then came the part of the story that the word punitive was always designed to hide. British soldiers moved through the smoking ruins of the royal palace and systematically stripped it of everything they could carry. More than 4,000 sacred and ceremonial objects, brass plaques depicting centuries of Benin history, carved ivory tusks, ceremonial masks, royal regalia, were loaded up and shipped back to England. Here's the detail that should genuinely disturb you. This wasn't looting carried out by rogue soldiers acting against orders, the kind of thing empires like to dismiss afterward as the isolated actions of a few bad men. This was official. The British government authorized the sale of the stolen bronzes at auction in London, specifically to help cover the cost of the military expedition that had just burned Benin City to the ground. Read that again. The people of Benin didn't just lose their king, their capital, and centuries of their sacred history in a matter of weeks. Their own stolen treasures were then sold off to pay for the very invasion that took them. Today, walk through certain galleries of the British Museum, and you'll find some of those same bronzes, sitting in quiet, climate-controlled glass cases, presented as remarkable examples of African artistic achievement, which they absolutely are. With a small plaque nearby that mentions, almost in passing, that they arrived in London following punitive action in 1897. No mention of the machine guns, no mention of the burned city, no mention of the auction house that helped fund the whole operation. When Nigeria has formally requested the return of these bronzes, and they have, repeatedly, for decades, the museum's answer has historically been polite, careful, and firm: no. They cite concerns about security, about climate control, about whether Nigerian institutions are equipped to properly preserve such fragile, priceless items. It's worth sitting with the irony of that argument for a moment. The country being told it isn't equipped to protect its own heritage is the same country whose heritage was only ever endangered in the first place because a foreign army burned its capital city to the ground and shipped the survivors' cultural memory overseas as war spoils. Now let's cross the Mediterranean, because the next chapter of this story isn't about a war at all. It's about one arrogant British aristocrat who decided an ancient temple's most sacred sculptures simply belonged to him, and a piece of paper so questionable that, over 2 centuries later, nobody has ever been able to produce the original. For over 2,000 years, the Parthenon stood on top of the Acropolis in Athens, watching empires rise and collapse around it. It survived earthquakes. It survived fires. It survived being converted into a Christian church, then later a Byzantine cathedral, then later still an Ottoman mosque, its ancient sculptures somehow surviving every single transformation. It survived the Venetian bombardment of 1687, when an artillery shell struck a gunpowder store the Ottomans had stashed inside the building, blowing out much of its center and scattering marble across the hillside. And it still survived even that. What it could not survive was Thomas Bruce, the 7th Earl of Elgin. In 1801, Elgin was serving as the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, which at the time controlled Greece. He arrived in Athens, claiming a purely scholarly interest. He wanted to have artists sketch and cast the extraordinary sculptures that had decorated the Parthenon's exterior for over 2 millennia, works widely considered among the finest achievements of ancient sculpture ever produced. Sketching wasn't enough for Elgin. Casting wasn't enough. He wanted to own the originals outright and ship them back to decorate his private estate in Scotland. He claimed to have obtained a firman, an official Ottoman decree, granting him permission to remove the sculptures. There's a rather enormous problem with that claim, one that historians have wrestled with for 2 centuries. The original document has never once been found. No original copy exists in Ottoman archives. No original copy exists anywhere. The only evidence Elgin ever produced was a second-hand Italian translation of the supposed decree, and even that translation, read carefully, only granted permission to make drawings, take measurements, and remove a few loose stones already lying on the ground. It said nothing whatsoever about tearing sculptures directly off a still-standing, sacred ancient building. Elgin didn't wait around to clarify the fine print. He hired a crew equipped with heavy saws and iron crowbars, in some cases, to detach sculptures still firmly embedded in the temple's structure. His workers reportedly resorted to using explosives strong enough to crack the ancient stone. They didn't collect fallen fragments off the ground. They physically hacked more than half of the Parthenon's surviving sculptural decoration directly off the building. An act that, by multiple contemporary accounts, damaged the temple's structural integrity in the process. Entire figures were sawed in half to make them lighter and easier to transport across the sea. Even back in Britain, at the height of the empire's confidence, this wasn't universally celebrated. The poet Lord Byron, who had traveled through Greece and witnessed the damage firsthand, was furious. He publicly called Elgin a vandal, accused him of plundering treasures that time itself had spared, and wrote scathing verses comparing Elgin's actions to the very barbarism the British claimed to be superior to. None of that outrage stopped the British government from purchasing the stolen marbles from Elgin in 1816 at a steep discount from what he'd spent acquiring and shipping them, after his own scandalous divorce and mounting debts left him desperate for cash. The marbles have remained in the British Museum ever since, housed today in a dedicated gallery built specifically to display them. For decades, the museum's official defense rested heavily on a practical argument. Greece, they claimed, simply didn't have a facility capable of preserving such fragile, priceless works properly. That argument quietly collapsed in 2009 when Greece opened the stunning, state-of-the-art Acropolis Museum at the base of the hill the Parthenon still stands on. Complete with a vast, brilliantly lit top-floor gallery, positioned with a direct line of sight to the temple itself, deliberately left with empty spaces exactly where the missing sculptures would go. It was, in effect, an open invitation extended in glass and steel and natural light. Bring them home, and we will finally complete the display exactly the way it was always meant to be seen, in view of the very building they came from. London's answer remained no. The Parthenon marbles reveal something the Rosetta Stone and the Benin Bronzes only hint at. That sometimes the looting of a nation's identity didn't even require a war. It just required one man with enough arrogance, enough money, and a government back home willing to look the other way, buy the loot, and call it culture. But if you think a single lord vandalizing one ancient temple represents the peak of imperial greed, you haven't yet heard what happened when the British Army marched into the mountains of Ethiopia and looted an entire royal library, an entire treasury, and the single holiest objects an ancient Christian kingdom possessed. Items so sacred that most Ethiopians themselves aren't permitted to look directly at them. High in the rugged mountains of what is now Ethiopia stood the fortress of Magdala, the stronghold of Emperor Tawadros II. A ruler who had spent much of his reign trying to modernize and unify his empire, and who had, by 1868, found himself in an escalating standoff with the British government over a diplomatic dispute involving imprisoned British subjects. Britain's response was to send an enormous invasion force. Tens of thousands of soldiers, along with a small army of specially imported elephants to haul heavy artillery through mountain terrain that had never before seen anything like a modern European army marching through it. Facing certain, total defeat, Emperor Tawadros made a final, devastating choice. Rather than surrender and be paraded as a captured trophy of the British Empire, he took his own life inside the fortress walls. What happened in the hours and days that followed is often reduced, in British accounts from the period, to a triumphant military victory. It was something else entirely. One of the most brazen, state-organized acts of cultural plunder in the entire history of the empire. British soldiers poured into Magdala's royal treasury and its ancient churches, and they didn't limit themselves to gold, weapons, or anything with obvious military value. They emptied the fortress of its cultural and religious soul. Centuries-old illuminated manuscripts, hand-copied and illustrated by generations of Ethiopian monks, were stacked up and carried away by the crate load. Royal crowns, ceremonial jewelry, and religious icons vanished into military supply wagons. Perhaps most devastating of all, soldiers seized several tabots, sacred replica altar tablets central to Ethiopian Orthodox Christian worship, objects so holy that ordinary worshippers, and even many priests, are never permitted to look directly at them, let alone touch them. To this day, they remain among the most sensitive religious objects in Ethiopian culture. The sheer scale of what was taken from Magdala was so enormous that the British military had to bring in 15 elephants and nearly 200 mules solely to transport the stolen treasure back down the mountain and out of the country. Here is where this story shifts from a brutal military plunder into something even more calculated. Before the loot was even fully off the mountain, the British Army held an on-the-spot auction of many of the looted items, right there in the field. And sitting in that improvised auction, spending money provided directly by the British government, was a man named Richard Holmes, an official representative sent specifically by the British Museum with the explicit purpose of acquiring antiquities from the very campaign that produced them. This wasn't a museum passively receiving donated war trophies decades after the fact, with some polite distance from the violence involved. This was a museum actively embedded in the looting operation itself, purchasing stolen sacred objects while the smoke from a conquered fortress was, quite literally, still rising behind them. Today, some of the most sacred religious artifacts ever taken from Ethiopia remain locked away in the British Museum's storage rooms, not even on public display, because officials themselves have acknowledged they are too religiously sensitive to be exhibited as museum curiosities. And yet, despite acknowledging that sensitivity, The museum has continued to refuse full repatriation of the tabots to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the very institution that considers them sacred. Think about the strange, almost impossible logic embedded in that decision. The museum argues it must safeguard humanity's shared cultural heritage. But how exactly do you protect a heritage by hiding it in a windowless storage room, thousands of miles away from the only people on Earth who consider it holy, permanently out of reach of the community whose faith it belongs to? Before we get to the museum's final defense, there are two more stories worth knowing, because they prove this pattern wasn't limited to one continent, one century, or one kind of victim. In October of 1860, during the Second Opium War, British and French forces marched into Beijing and arrived at the Old Summer Palace. Not a single building, but an almost unimaginably vast complex of palaces, gardens, libraries, and pavilions that Chinese emperors had spent over a century filling with some of the greatest art and craftsmanship the empire had ever produced. European visitors who saw it before its destruction compared it, without exaggeration, to a paradise on earth. British and French troops spent days looting the complex of everything that could be carried: porcelain, jade, silk, ancient manuscripts, gold ornaments, bronze sculptures representing the 12 animals of the Chinese zodiac. And once the looting was finished, the British commander, Lord Elgin's own son, the 8th Earl of Elgin, continuing a family tradition of destruction 2 generations running, gave the order to burn what remained to the ground, specifically as a punishment intended to humiliate the Chinese emperor personally. It took 3,000 British soldiers several days to complete the burning. Smoke from the fires reportedly hung over Beijing for weeks. An entire architectural and artistic achievement, centuries in the making, was reduced to ash and rubble in a matter of days, and whatever survived the fire was carried out of the country as trophies. Some of those looted objects sit in the British Museum today. Others are scattered across private collections and museums throughout Europe. China has spent decades trying to track down and recover even a fraction of what was taken that October, piece by piece, auction by auction, most of it never to be found again. Then there's a story from the opposite end of the world entirely. A small, isolated volcanic island in the Pacific that most people know today simply as Easter Island. In 1868, a British naval vessel called the Hams Topaz anchored off the island's coast. Its crew, at the request of British officials eager to bring home something remarkable for the museum's collection, removed one of the island's sacred moai, the massive stone statues carved by the Rapa Nui people to represent the spirits of their ancestors. This particular statue, known as Ho Hakananaya, was pried from the ground where it had stood for centuries, loaded onto the ship, and carried across 2 oceans to London. The Rapa Nui people were not asked. They were, at the time, a small and vulnerable population who had already endured devastating slave raids and disease brought by earlier foreign contact, leaving their community a fraction of its former size. There was no meaningful negotiation, no consent freely given by people in any position to refuse a foreign warship anchored just off their shore. Ho Hakananaya remains in the British Museum today, one of the most visited objects in the entire building. For years, representatives of the Rapa Nui community have traveled to London specifically to ask for their ancestors' statue to be returned home. They've described the statue not as an art object at all, but as a living relative, still separated from its family after more than a century and a half. The museum's answer, once again, has been to keep it exactly where it is. 2 continents, 2 centuries apart, 2 peoples who never got a vote. The same institution, the same shelf, the same silence, whenever the question of returning it comes up. So here we are, standing in front of 6 of the most famous display cases in the world, and each one of them tells the exact same underlying story, dressed up in different centuries, different continents, and different costumes. A treaty that never consulted the people whose history was being traded away. A massacre dressed up in official paperwork as a punitive expedition, with the stolen goods auctioned off to cover the cost of the very violence that produced them. A lord who forged his way past a fragile legal document to hack apart a 2,000-year-old temple, simply because he wanted the pieces for himself. A royal library and a sacred altar, stripped from a mountain fortress, with a museum representative standing in the crowd at the looting auction itself, checkbook in hand. a paradise of palaces burned to the ground over 3 days, its treasures scattered to trophy cabinets an ocean away. And a stone ancestor, pried out of the earth of a small Pacific island and never allowed to go home. Every single time, the pattern repeats. The people whose heritage was taken were never in the room when the decision was made. Not at the Treaty of Alexandria, not in the negotiations over Benin's palm oil trade, not in whatever conversation Lord Elgin had with himself about whether hacking apart a sacred temple was acceptable. Not at that impromptu battlefield auction on the plains of Ethiopia. Which brings us to the question the British Museum has spent well over a century very carefully avoiding. If the Rosetta Stone, the Benin Bronzes, the Parthenon marbles, the treasures of Magdala, the plunder of the Summer Palace, and a stolen ancestor from Easter Island were all acquired through war, coercion, and outright theft, then what, exactly, is left to justify keeping any of them? The museum's most consistent argument today is that these objects are safer, better preserved, and more accessible to a global audience in London than they would be anywhere else. It's an argument that quietly assumes the countries these objects were stolen from remain, even now, somehow less capable of caring for their own history. The very same condescending logic that justified taking these objects away from them in the first place. Maybe the deepest, most uncomfortable truth in this entire story isn't just what was stolen. It's how completely normal, how thoroughly respectable the theft has been allowed to become. These aren't hidden treasures smuggled through some black market, sold in a dark alley to a private collector. They are proudly displayed, brightly lit, meticulously labeled, visited by millions of people every year who walk past them without a second thought about how they actually got there. The crime isn't hidden. It's on public display, 7 days a week, completely free of charge. So the next time you see a photograph of the Rosetta Stone, or the Parthenon marbles standing in their quiet London gallery, or a Benin bronze plaque gleaming under a museum spotlight, ask yourself the question the museum has never really wanted anyone to ask out loud. Not whether these objects are beautiful. They obviously are. But whether beauty was ever supposed to be enough to make people stop asking where something actually came from. If this changed the way you'll look at a museum the next time you walk through one, let me know in the comments which artifact you think deserves to go home first. The Rosetta Stone, the Benin Bronzes, the Parthenon marbles, the treasures of Magdala, the Summer Palace relics, or the stolen moai of Easter Island. If you want more of these uncensored deep dives into the history they never quite finished telling you in school, subscribe to Chronosphere Academy, because we're just getting started. Share this with someone who's never questioned what's actually sitting behind that glass. Until next time, keep asking where it really came from. And I will see you in the next chapter of Chronosphere Academy.